The story of the Native American chief who stood against European colonization is one of resilience, strategy, and defiance. His name echoes through history as a leader who not only expelled Spanish invaders from his lands but also came perilously close to driving the English out as well. His legacy is a testament to the fierce resistance mounted by indigenous peoples against the encroachment of foreign powers. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, the land was home to thriving native communities with complex societies, trade networks, and governance structures. These were not empty territories waiting to be claimed but well-established nations with their own laws, traditions, and histories. Among them was a chief whose leadership would shape the course of colonial encounters in ways few could have anticipated. When the Spanish first arrived, they came with the dual mission of conquest and conversion. Their expeditions, fueled by dreams of gold and divine mandate, often brought violence and subjugation. Many native leaders were forced into submission, their people decimated by warfare and disease. But this chief was different. He recognized the threat early and rallied his warriors, not just for battle but for a sustained resistance that would push the invaders back. The Spanish, accustomed to overwhelming indigenous forces with superior weaponry and tactics, found themselves facing an adversary who adapted quickly. The chief studied their methods, learned their weaknesses, and turned their own strategies against them. Through a combination of guerrilla warfare, strategic alliances with neighboring tribes, and an intimate knowledge of the land, he orchestrated a series of defeats that forced the Spanish to retreat. For a time, his people were free from foreign domination. But the respite was short-lived. The English, seeing the Spanish failure, saw an opportunity to expand their own colonial ambitions. They arrived with promises of trade and cooperation, but the chief knew better. He had seen the pattern before, the slow encroachment, the broken treaties, the eventual displacement. Once again, he prepared his people for war. The English, underestimating his resolve, believed they could negotiate where the Spanish had failed. They were wrong. The chief's forces struck with precision, targeting supply lines and settlements. The English found themselves bogged down in a conflict they had not anticipated, one that drained their resources and tested their resolve. For years, the struggle continued. The English, though better equipped, could not break his resistance. The chief's ability to unite disparate tribes under a common cause made his forces formidable. His understanding of European tactics allowed him to counter their advances effectively. At several points, victory seemed within his grasp. Had circumstances been slightly different, history might remember him as the leader who expelled two colonial powers, but the tides of history are rarely swayed by a single hand. Despite his brilliance, external factors, disease, dwindling resources, and the sheer scale of European colonization, began to take their toll. The English, learning from their mistakes, adapted their strategies. New waves of settlers arrived, and the balance of power shifted. Yet, even in retreat, the chief's legacy endured. His resistance delayed English expansion, buying time for other native nations to prepare their own defenses. His tactics influenced future indigenous leaders who would continue the fight against colonization. And most importantly, his story serves as a reminder that the conquest of the Americas was never inevitable. It was contested at every turn by leaders who refused to surrender. This expanded narrative explores the depth of his struggle, the alliances he forged, the battles he fought, and the lasting impact of his resistance. It is a story not just of war, but of leadership, adaptation, and the unyielding will to protect one's homeland against overwhelming odds. The early 17th century marked a tumultuous period for the indigenous peoples of Senecomica, the homeland of the Powhatan Confederacy, as European colonizers began establishing a permanent presence in their territory. Among the most formidable leaders who emerged to resist this encroachment was Opachancanough, a paramount chief and warrior whose tactical brilliance and unyielding defiance shaped the course of indigenous resistance. His strategies were multifaceted, blending military ingenuity, psychological warfare, political maneuvering, and cultural resilience. Unlike his brother, Wahunsankaw, commonly known as Chief Powhatan, who initially sought coexistence through diplomacy, Opachancanough recognized the existential threat posed by the English settlers and waged a relentless struggle to expel them. His resistance was not merely a series of battles but a calculated, protracted campaign aimed at preserving his people's sovereignty, land, and way of life. One of Opochancanos' most defining strategies was his mastery of deception and patience. Understanding that the English colonists vastly underestimated indigenous intelligence and military capability, he lulled them into a false sense of security. For years, he maintained an outward appearance of cooperation, even as he meticulously prepared for a decisive strike. This culminated in the devastating 1622 uprising, where his forces launched a synchronized attack on multiple settlements, killing nearly a third of the Virginia colonists in a single day. The assault was not a spontaneous act of violence but the result of years of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination among allied tribes. By striking when the English least expected it, Opochancanos shattered their illusion of control and demonstrated the resilience of indigenous resistance. Another critical aspect of Opochancanos' strategy was his ability to forge and maintain alliances. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a monolithic entity but a network of diverse tribes, each with its own interests and grievances. Opochancanos skillfully navigated these complexities, uniting disparate groups under a common cause. He leveraged kinship ties, trade relationships, and shared animosity toward the colonists to build a broad coalition. This unity was essential in sustaining prolonged resistance, as it prevented the English from exploiting divisions among indigenous nations. Furthermore, Opochancanos sought alliances beyond the Powhatan Confederacy, reaching out to other native nations to create a wider front against European expansion. His diplomatic efforts underscored his understanding that survival required solidarity beyond immediate tribal affiliations. Military innovation was another cornerstone of Opochancanos' resistance. Unlike conventional European warfare, which relied on open field engagements and rigid formations, indigenous tactics emphasized mobility, ambush, and asymmetrical warfare. Opochancanos' forces excelled in guerrilla tactics, using the dense forests and waterways of Virginia to their advantage. They conducted swift raids, disrupted supply lines, and vanished before the English could mount a counteroffensive. This approach not only inflicted heavy casualties but also sowed fear and uncertainty among the colonists, who struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Opochancanos' ability to adapt his strategies in response to changing circumstances, such as English technological superiority, highlighted his strategic flexibility. Psychological warfare played a significant role in Opochancanos' campaigns. He understood that demoralizing the enemy was as important as defeating them in battle. The 1622 attack, for instance, was not just a military victory but a psychological blow that shook the foundations of the Virginia colony. The English, who had believed themselves secure, were suddenly confronted with the reality of indigenous power. Opochancanos further exploited this fear by allowing survivors to spread tales of the attack, amplifying its impact. Additionally, he used selective violence, sparing some colonists to deliver messages or negotiate, to keep the English off balance. This calculated use of terror and diplomacy demonstrated his keen understanding of human psychology and its role in warfare. Opochancanos' resistance was also deeply rooted in cultural preservation. He recognized that European colonization threatened not only indigenous land but also their spiritual beliefs, social structures, and traditions. His defiance was thus as much about cultural survival as it was about territorial defense. By rejecting assimilation and maintaining traditional practices, he reinforced a sense of identity and purpose among his people. This cultural resilience made the Powhatan resistance more than a military conflict. It became a movement to safeguard an entire way of life. Despite his eventual capture and death in 1646, Opochancanos' legacy endured. His strategies influenced subsequent indigenous resistance movements across the Americas, proving that even against overwhelming odds, determined leadership and innovative tactics could sustain prolonged defiance. His life and struggle remain a testament to the enduring spirit of indigenous resistance against colonization. The abduction of Paquico marked a pivotal moment in his life, shaping not only his personal perspective but also the trajectory of his leadership and subsequent actions. Before the event, Paquico was known as a charismatic and visionary figure, one who inspired loyalty and commanded respect through his words and deeds. His followers saw in him a leader who could unite disparate factions and navigate the complex political landscape with wisdom and courage. However, the experience of being forcibly taken, held against his will, and subjected to unknown pressures altered him in profound ways, leaving an indelible mark on his approach to governance, strategy, and interpersonal relations. Prior to his abduction, Paquico's leadership style was characterized by openness and a willingness to engage in dialogue, even with adversaries. He believed in the power of negotiation and often sought to resolve conflicts through diplomatic means rather than brute force. His ability to empathize with different viewpoints made him a unifying force, and his decisions were often guided by a sense of fairness and long-term stability. Yet, the trauma of captivity forced him to reassess these principles. The isolation, the uncertainty of his fate, and the potential betrayal by those he once trusted instilled in him a newfound wariness. Where he had once extended trust freely, he now scrutinized alliances with caution. The psychological toll of the abduction cannot be understated. Leaders who endure such ordeals often emerge with a hardened resolve, and Paquico was no exception. The experience stripped away any lingering naivety, replacing it with a steely determination to never again be vulnerable to external manipulation. This shift manifested in his policies, which became more assertive, even aggressive at times. Where he had once sought compromise, he now prioritized preemptive action to neutralize threats before they could materialize. His inner circle noticed the change, his speeches carried a sharper edge, his strategies a more calculated ruthlessness. Some praised this transformation as necessary for survival in a treacherous political climate, while others lamented the loss of the more conciliatory leader they had once admired. Moreover, the abduction influenced Paquico's approach to security and intelligence. Having been taken so unexpectedly, he became acutely aware of the fragility of his position. He invested heavily in personal protection, expanding his network of informants and tightening control over those with access to him. Loyalty became the paramount virtue among his advisors, and dissent was met with swift repercussions. This emphasis on security, while understandable, also bred an atmosphere of suspicion within his ranks. Where there had once been open debate, now there was hesitation, fear of saying the wrong thing, of being perceived as disloyal. The very cohesion he had once fostered through trust was now maintained through vigilance and, at times, intimidation. Yet, paradoxically, the abduction also deepened Paquico's connection with his people. Having faced mortal danger, he spoke with greater urgency about the struggles of the oppressed, drawing parallels between his own suffering and the hardships endured by the populace. His rhetoric became more impassioned, his calls for unity more fervent. He used his ordeal as a symbol of resilience, framing his survival as proof of his destiny to lead his people through adversity. This narrative resonated deeply, reinvigorating his base and attracting new followers who saw in him a leader tempered by hardship. In the broader historical context, the abduction of Paquico serves as a case study in how personal trauma can redefine leadership. His transformation from a conciliator to a hardened strategist reflects the pressures of power in turbulent times. While some argue that his later actions were justified by the need for survival, others contend that the abduction robbed him of the very qualities that made his leadership unique. Regardless, one thing remains certain: the event irrevocably changed him, and through him, the course of history. In the early 17th century, Virginia was a stage for complex interactions between native peoples, English colonists, and representatives of other European powers, including the Spanish and the Jesuits. Jesuit missions were part of Spain's efforts to spread Catholicism among indigenous populations, and their presence and influence had far-reaching implications for local tribal politics, including the decision of Powhatan leader Opechancanough to attack English settlements in 1622. To understand the factors that led to this attack, it is essential to examine the broader historical context. The English arrived in Virginia in 1607, establishing Jamestown and shifting the region's power dynamics. Meanwhile, the Spanish, who had already established a strong presence in Florida and Mexico, sought to expand their influence northward. The Jesuits were at the forefront of these efforts, sending missions to convert native peoples and advance Spanish interests. Opechancanough, the brother of the paramount Powhatan chief, was a pivotal figure in resisting English expansion. Unlike his brother, who sometimes pursued negotiation, Opechancanough saw the English as an existential threat that needed to be confronted with force. This is where the Jesuit mission enters the picture. Before the English arrival, the Spanish had attempted to build relations with the Powhatan tribes, sending missionaries such as Father Juan Bautista de Segura, who established a short-lived mission in the region. Although these missions ultimately failed, Opochancanos' interactions with the Spanish and the Jesuits likely shaped his perceptions of the English. He may have viewed the Spanish as potential allies against the new invaders, or at least understood through them that Europeans were not a monolithic force but competing powers whose rivalries could be exploited. Additionally, the Jesuits may have reinforced Opochancanos' understanding of the threat posed by the English, particularly in the context of colonial expansion and growing demands for land and resources. Furthermore, the Catholic doctrine preached by the Jesuits might have influenced Opochancanos' framing of the conflict. While the English focused on settlement and economic exploitation, the Jesuits presented a religious narrative depicting a struggle between good and evil, a perspective that may have strengthened Opochancanos' resolve to resist the English as a hostile force. However, it is important not to overstate the Jesuits' role. Opochancanos' decision to attack the English was primarily driven by local factors, such as land encroachment, economic pressures, and the desire to preserve his people's sovereignty. Nevertheless, his encounters with the Jesuit mission were part of the broader context that helped him assess the English threat and evaluate his strategic options. Ultimately, the 1622 attack was a pivotal moment in colonial Virginia's history, exposing the fragility of the apparent peace between the two sides. While the Jesuit mission's direct role may have been limited, its presence contributed to shaping the political and diplomatic environment in which Opochancanough made his fateful decision. The relationship between Wanchese, the influential Native American leader of the Roanoke people, and the English settlers is a complex and evolving narrative that spans cultural exchange, conflict, and shifting alliances. In the late 16th century, when English explorers first arrived on the shores of present-day North Carolina, they encountered the indigenous tribes of the region, including the Roanoke, led by figures such as Wanchese and Wingina. The initial interactions were marked by curiosity and cautious diplomacy, as both sides sought to understand the intentions of the other. The English, driven by ambitions of colonization and resource extraction, viewed the Native Americans as both potential allies and obstacles, while Wanchese and his people likely saw the newcomers as unpredictable outsiders who could either bring trade opportunities or threaten their sovereignty. The first sustained contact occurred during the expeditions of Sir Walter Raleigh's scouts, particularly Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow in 1584. Their reports described the native inhabitants as hospitable, engaging in trade and cultural exchanges. Wanchese himself traveled to England in 1584 alongside Manteo, another prominent Roanoke leader, where he was introduced to English society, including the court of Queen Elizabeth I. This journey was a strategic move by the English to foster goodwill and gather intelligence, but for Wanchese, it was an opportunity to assess the strength and intentions of these foreign invaders. His time in England exposed him to the vast power and technological advancements of the English, which may have influenced his later stance toward the settlers. Upon returning to Roanoke, Wanchese's perspective on the English appeared to shift. Unlike Manteo, who maintained a cooperative relationship with the colonists, Wanchese grew increasingly wary of their presence. The establishment of the ill-fated Roanoke colony in 1585 under Governor Ralph Lane further strained relations. The English, struggling to sustain themselves, became more dependent on and demanding of the local tribes for food and supplies. Tensions escalated when misunderstandings and cultural clashes led to violent confrontations. The killing of Wingina, a paramount chief and possibly Wanchese's ally or relative, by the English in 1586 marked a turning point. This act of betrayal solidified Wanchese's distrust and likely pushed him toward active resistance. The subsequent years saw the English make repeated but unsuccessful attempts to establish a permanent settlement, culminating in the mysterious disappearance of the lost colony by 1590. Wanchese's role in these events remains debated, but some historians suggest that he may have been involved in resisting or even expelling the settlers. The English, preoccupied with other ventures and the Anglo-Spanish War, temporarily withdrew from the region, leaving the Roanoke people to reclaim their lands, though European diseases and prior conflicts had already taken a heavy toll. In the decades that followed, English colonization efforts shifted northward to Jamestown, 1607, but the legacy of Wanchese's resistance lingered. His story represents an early example of Native American leadership navigating the challenges of European encroachment, balancing diplomacy with defiance. Over time, as English power grew, many tribes were displaced or assimilated, but the initial encounters with leaders like Wanchi set a precedent for indigenous resistance and adaptation. The relationship between Wanchis and the English thus evolved from tentative cooperation to outright hostility, reflecting the broader trajectory of Native European relations in early colonial America. In the ominous dawn of a spring day in 1622, events unfolded that would alter the course of history in the English colony of Virginia. Opechancanough, the shrewd leader of the Powhatan Confederacy, led a bloody attack against English settlers who had increasingly encroached upon his people's lands. These assaults were not merely a fleeting military reaction but a spark that ignited profound consequences, the echoes of which would reverberate for decades, shaping the relationship between Native Americans and colonists in North America. Initially, the attack was sudden and brutal, with hundreds of English men, women, and children falling victim to meticulously planned massacres. Yet, despite the early tactical success, the strategic consequences proved catastrophic for the indigenous tribes. The events provoked furious retaliation from the colonists, leading to brutal campaigns that targeted not only warriors but also Native American civilians, including elders and children. These confrontations rapidly deteriorated already fragile relations, shattering any hope of peaceful coexistence. In the long term, Opechancanoug's attacks pushed the English to adopt more aggressive policies toward Native Americans, including the systematic seizure of land and the expansion of laws stripping them of their rights. These events also reinforced the colonists' prejudiced view of indigenous peoples, later used to justify land dispossession under the guise of civilization and religion. Demographically, the attacks, along with ensuing famines and diseases, caused a sharp decline in Native American populations, while English immigration continued unabated. The colony, despite initial losses, emerged militarily and administratively stronger, enforcing stricter laws to ensure settler loyalty and military dominance. Perhaps the deepest impact, however, was the shift in colonial ideology itself. Whereas the English had once viewed Native Americans as potential trade partners or converts to Christianity, they now saw them as obstacles to be removed. This mindset became entrenched in colonial culture and influenced later American policies toward indigenous peoples for centuries to come. Opechancanoug's attacks were not merely a bloody chapter in a series of conflicts but a pivotal turning point that defined the relationship between Europe and the New World, one built on destruction and domination rather than understanding or integration. Opechancanoug's attacks were a pivotal turning point in the history of English settlement in Virginia. During the early 17th century, these attacks were not merely acts of fleeting violence but a strategically calculated response to the ever-expanding encroachment of English colonists onto his people's lands. From the arrival of the settlers in Jamestown in 1607, tensions had been escalating between the two groups. The English viewed the land as an inexhaustible resource to be exploited, while the Native Americans saw it as a sacred heritage that could not be relinquished. Over the years, clashes intensified, especially after the death of Chief Powhatan, Opechancanoug's brother, as the latter believed that his brother's policy of peace had failed to restrain the colonists. In 1622, Opechancanough launched a sudden and bloody assault on English settlements, killing hundreds of settlers in a single day. This attack was not just an act of retaliation but an attempt to expel the English from the region entirely. Although the attack did not achieve its ultimate goal, it left a profound impact on the settlers' psyche and their settlement policies. After years of believing that the natives could be easily assimilated or subdued, the English realized that peaceful coexistence might be impossible without complete military dominance. The attack brought about a radical shift in English settlement patterns. Instead of unchecked expansion, settlers began constructing fortified strongholds, and local militias were organized more effectively. Additionally, the Virginia Company abandoned its policy of dividing native tribes and began treating all indigenous people as potential enemies. The attack also pushed English authorities to adopt harsher policies, including the destruction of native crops and villages to force surrender or starvation. In the long term, Opechancanoug's attacks accelerated English expansion but in a more systematic and violent manner. Rather than attempting coexistence, the objective became clear: to subjugate the land and its people by force. This approach continued even after Opochancanos' death in 1646, as Virginia became a model for English colonization in North America, based on the complete displacement of native populations. Thus, it can be said that Opochancanos' attacks did not halt English expansion but transformed its nature, paving the way for aggressive settlement policies that shaped the future of the American colonies. At the beginning of the 17th century, the English colonies in Virginia were experiencing a critical phase of expansion and relative stability. However, this calm did not last long, as these settlements witnessed a series of sudden and bloody attacks led by the Powhatan leader Opochancanough. These attacks had far-reaching economic consequences that altered the course of the colony and affected its relationship with the Native Americans for many years. These assaults were part of a calculated strategy aimed at expelling the settlers from lands the Powhatan people considered their own. However, the outcome was not what Opochancanough had anticipated. Instead, it led to a series of economic shifts that weakened both sides, albeit to varying degrees. Initially, Virginia's economy relied almost entirely on tobacco cultivation, which had become the primary cash crop attracting both investors and settlers. However, with Opochancanough attacks in 1622 and 1644, plantations and homesteads were destroyed, leading to heavy losses in lives and property. Hundreds of settlers were killed, tobacco crops were ruined, and storage facilities containing supplies and goods imported from England were burned. The losses were not only material but also led to a collapse of trust between the colonists and the Native Americans, making trade cooperation between the two sides nearly impossible. The destruction of crops caused a sharp decline in tobacco production, impacting exports to Europe and significantly reducing the colony's economic revenues. Fear of further attacks also discouraged settlers from expanding into inland territories, limiting available farmland and slowing economic growth. The Virginia Company, which managed the colony, was forced to increase spending on defense, leading to rising debts and reduced investment in other projects that could have revitalized the economy. Perhaps the most painful economic consequence was the shift in the colony's policy toward Native Americans. After the attacks, Virginia abandoned any attempts at peaceful coexistence and adopted an openly hostile stance, launching retaliatory campaigns that destroyed entire villages and terrorized neighboring tribes. These campaigns cost the colony additional resources but also eliminated any chance of restoring the previously profitable trade relations between the two sides. Over time, Virginia gradually recovered, but in a different form. The economy shifted toward greater reliance on forced labor, particularly with the increasing number of enslaved Africans, permanently altering the colony's social and economic structure. Thus, Opochancanough attacks were not merely a fleeting military event but a profound economic turning point that shaped Virginia for decades to come. The early 17th century marked a tumultuous period in the history of English colonization in North America, a time when the delicate and often volatile relationships between European settlers and indigenous peoples were being forged through conflict, negotiation, and mutual suspicion. Among the most formidable native leaders of this era was Opochancanough, the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, whose military strategies and resistance efforts against English encroachment left an indelible mark on the trajectory of English-Native American relations. His tactics, ranging from calculated diplomacy to sudden, devastating warfare, reshaped the dynamics of power in the Chesapeake region and set a precedent for future indigenous resistance movements. Opochancanoug's rise to prominence occurred against the backdrop of increasing English settlement, particularly following the establishment of Jamestown in 1607. Initially, the Powhatan Confederacy, under the leadership of his brother Wahunsenkaw, known as Chief Powhatan, pursued a policy of cautious engagement with the English, alternating between trade and intimidation. However, as the colonists expanded their territory and demands grew more aggressive, Opochancanough emerged as a staunch advocate for a more militant approach. Unlike his brother, who had sought to incorporate the English into his tributary network, Opochancanough viewed them as an existential threat to Powhatan sovereignty and way of life. The first major demonstration of Opochancanoug's tactical acumen came in 1622, when he orchestrated a meticulously planned surprise attack on English settlements along the James River. This assault, which resulted in the deaths of nearly a third of the Virginia colonists, was not a spontaneous act of violence but a deliberate strategy to expel the English through overwhelming force. By striking multiple settlements simultaneously, Opechancanough sought to demonstrate the vulnerability of the English and undermine their perception of invincibility. The attack sent shockwaves through the colony, forcing the English to reassess their military preparedness and diplomatic strategies. In the aftermath of the 1622 offensive, the English response was swift and brutal. They abandoned any pretense of peaceful coexistence and adopted a policy of total war, targeting not only Powhatan warriors but also non-combatants, destroying crops, and burning villages. This escalation marked a turning point in English-Native American relations, as the colonists abandoned earlier attempts at assimilation in favor of outright subjugation. The Virginia Company, which had once promoted the idea of converting and civilizing native peoples, now openly called for their extermination. Opechancanoug's tactics, however, were not limited to military confrontation. He also understood the importance of psychological warfare and the power of perception. By maintaining an aura of unpredictability, he kept the English in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when or where the next attack might come. This strategy prolonged the conflict, draining colonial resources and morale. Even in his later years, when age and physical limitations reduced his ability to lead in battle, his reputation alone remained a powerful deterrent against English aggression. The second major uprising in 1644, led by an elderly but still defiant Opechancanough, further underscored his enduring influence. Though less devastating than the 1622 attack, this rebellion demonstrated that the Powhatan people remained a formidable force despite decades of warfare and displacement. The English, now more entrenched and numerically superior, ultimately captured Opechancanough, but his legacy lived on. His death in captivity did not mark the end of native resistance, rather, it inspired future generations of indigenous leaders to adopt similar strategies of coordinated resistance against European expansion. Opechancanoug's tactics had far-reaching consequences for English-Native American relations. His use of large-scale, surprise attacks became a model for other indigenous nations resisting colonization, influencing later conflicts such as King Philip's War in New England and the Yamasee War in the Carolinas. The English, meanwhile, learned from their encounters with Opechancanough the necessity of maintaining military superiority and the futility of relying solely on diplomacy when dealing with native nations unwilling to submit. Moreover, Opechancanoug's resistance accelerated the shift in English colonial policy from one of tentative coexistence to one of displacement and domination. The wars he initiated justified, in the eyes of the colonists, the seizure of native lands and the implementation of harsher laws restricting indigenous movement and autonomy. This pattern of violence and dispossession would repeat itself across the continent as English settlement expanded westward. Yet, despite the eventual decline of the Powhatan Confederacy, Opechancanoug's strategic vision left an enduring legacy. His understanding of asymmetric warfare, his ability to unite disparate groups against a common enemy, and his refusal to accept subjugation set a standard for indigenous resistance. In many ways, his struggles foreshadowed the broader conflicts that would define English-Native American relations for centuries to come, conflicts rooted in competing visions of land, power, and sovereignty. In examining Opechancanoug's impact, it becomes clear that his tactics were not merely reactions to immediate threats but part of a broader strategy to preserve native autonomy in the face of relentless colonial expansion. While the English ultimately prevailed militarily, the resistance he led ensured that the cost of conquest remained high. His story is a testament to the resilience of indigenous peoples and a reminder that the history of English-Native American relations was shaped as much by native agency as by colonial ambition. The brutal and coordinated assaults led by Opechancanough in 1622 against the English settlements in Virginia marked a turning point in the fraught relations between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. The attacks, which killed hundreds of settlers in a single day, sent shockwaves through the struggling colony and demanded an immediate and forceful military response. The English, though initially caught off guard, quickly mobilized their resources to retaliate with a campaign of relentless violence aimed at breaking the power of the Powhatan people once and for all. Governor Sir Francis Wyatt and the Colonial Council declared all-out war, abandoning previous attempts at diplomacy or coexistence. The English strategy was one of total warfare, burning villages, destroying crops, and targeting non-combatants to ensure the complete submission of the native population. Militias and armed bands scoured the countryside, launching punitive expeditions against any tribes suspected of allegiance to Opachancano. The colonists, fueled by vengeance and a desire to secure their foothold in Virginia, showed little mercy, often killing warriors and civilians alike. One of the key tactics employed by the English was the deliberate targeting of food supplies. By torching cornfields and storehouses, they sought to induce famine, weakening the Powhatan's ability to sustain resistance. This scorched earth approach, combined with relentless raids, gradually eroded Opachancano's capacity to mount further large-scale attacks. The English also fortified their settlements, constructing palisades and blockhouses to prevent future massacres, while offering bounties for the capture or killing of native leaders. Despite Opachancano's tactical brilliance and the resilience of his warriors, the overwhelming firepower and numbers of the English eventually turned the tide. After years of sporadic fighting, the aging chief was captured in 1646, paraded through Jamestown, and shot in the back by a vengeful guard, a symbolic end to his long resistance. The English victory solidified their dominance over the region, leading to further land seizures and the near destruction of the Powhatan Confederacy as a political force. The military response to Opachancano's uprising set a precedent for future colonial conflicts, demonstrating the English willingness to employ extreme violence to crush native resistance. It was a brutal chapter in the history of early America, one that foreshadowed the relentless expansion of European settlers at the expense of indigenous peoples. The strategy of fire engine was one of the brutal military tactics employed by the English during their conflict with the Powhatan people in the early 17th century. These tactics, literally translated as burning and wasting, were not merely random attacks but followed a systematic approach aimed at destroying the Powhatan's essential resources and breaking their resistance. When English colonists first arrived in Virginia in 1607, they initially relied on the assistance of the Powhatan tribes for survival. However, relations quickly soured due to the English settlers' increasing demands for food and land, as well as their attempts to assert dominance over the native population. By 1609, tensions reached a boiling point, leading to open warfare between the two sides. In this context, English leaders, particularly Governor Thomas Dale and John Smith, resorted to fire engine as a means of asserting control. The strategy involved sudden raids on indigenous villages, where homes, food stores, and crops were burned and destroyed. The goal was not only to inflict direct losses but also to deprive the Powhatan of their means of subsistence, forcing them into submission or starvation. During a notorious campaign in 1610, Thomas Gates led a group of English soldiers in a series of attacks that devastated entire villages. Historical records indicate that they set fire to fields and threw food supplies into the flames before the eyes of the native people, creating an atmosphere of terror and despair. These methods were not only violent but also psychological in nature, designed to shatter the morale of the Powhatan. While such tactics were not unprecedented in warfare, their use against the Powhatan had a devastating impact. Beyond material losses, these campaigns disrupted the social fabric of the tribes, forcing survivors to flee or surrender to the English. By 1614, the relentless pressure compelled Powhatan leader Wahunsenka to sign a peace treaty that marked the beginning of the end for his people's independence. However, the use of fire engine was not confined to the First Powhatan War. In the following decades, the English continued to apply this strategy against other tribes in Virginia, expanding the cycle of destruction and cementing a pattern of hostile relations between colonists and Native Americans. The English colonies in the Americas faced relentless challenges in the wake of violent conflicts with indigenous populations, European rivals, and the harsh realities of frontier life. Among the most devastating of these challenges were the twin scourges of disease and malnutrition, which often determined the survival or collapse of colonial settlements. When attacks occurred, whether from native warriors, Spanish forces, or other adversaries, the aftermath was frequently marked not only by immediate bloodshed but by the slow, grinding suffering brought on by epidemics and starvation. The colonies, already fragile in their infancy, found themselves caught in a vicious cycle where war disrupted food supplies, weakened immune systems, and created ideal conditions for the spread of deadly illnesses. Disease had been a silent killer long before the first English settlers set foot in the New World. Indigenous populations had already been decimated by pathogens introduced by earlier European contacts, and the colonists themselves were far from immune. After an attack, the close quarters of fortified settlements, combined with poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge, turned towns into breeding grounds for infection. Smallpox, dysentery, typhus, and yellow fever ravaged communities, often killing more people than the initial violence. The lack of understanding of germ theory meant that remedies were often ineffective or even harmful, relying on bleeding, purging, or dubious herbal treatments. Malnutrition exacerbated these conditions, as raids and sieges destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and cut off supply lines. Colonists who survived the violence often found themselves staring down the slower, more insidious threat of famine. Malnutrition was not merely a consequence of war but a force that shaped the very trajectory of colonial survival. In the aftermath of attacks, food stores were frequently looted or burned, leaving settlers to rely on dwindling reserves. The harsh winters, combined with the inability to plant or harvest, led to desperate measures. Colonists ate rats, boiled leather, and in some extreme cases, resorted to cannibalism, as evidenced by the infamous starving time in Jamestown. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, their weakened bodies succumbing first to hunger and then to opportunistic diseases. The psychological toll was immense, with survivors recounting hallucinations, despair, and a collapse of social order. The interplay between disease and malnutrition created a deadly synergy. A body weakened by hunger was far more susceptible to infection, and a population ravaged by illness could not labor in the fields to grow food. This vicious cycle left colonies vulnerable to further attacks, as their ability to mount a defense or sustain themselves eroded. In some cases, entire settlements were abandoned, their inhabitants either dead or scattered. The survivors who fled often carried diseases with them, spreading epidemics to neighboring colonies or indigenous villages, perpetuating the cycle of suffering. Moreover, the reliance on imported food from England proved disastrous when supply ships were delayed or sunk by enemy forces. The colonies had not yet achieved self-sufficiency in agriculture, and the disruption of trade routes left them perilously exposed. Even when food was available, poor preservation methods and contamination led to spoilage and foodborne illnesses. Salted meats, a staple of colonial diets, provided scant nutrition when fresh vegetables and fruits were unavailable, leading to scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The lack of dietary variety further weakened immune systems, making outbreaks all the more lethal. The colonial governments, such as they were, struggled to respond. Emergency rationing, pleas for aid from England, and forced requisitions from indigenous allies or neighboring settlements were common but often inadequate. Corruption and hoarding by colonial elites exacerbated shortages, leading to resentment and internal strife. In some instances, colonial leaders prioritized feeding soldiers over civilians, ensuring that militias remained functional while the general population starved. This decision, though perhaps militarily justified, deepened social divisions and eroded trust in colonial authority. The long-term consequences of these crises were profound. Colonies that endured repeated cycles of attack, disease, and malnutrition saw their populations stagnate or decline, slowing expansion and weakening their hold on contested territories. The high mortality rates also disrupted family structures, leaving widows, orphans, and broken communities in their wake. The psychological scars of such suffering influenced colonial attitudes toward indigenous peoples, often hardening perceptions and justifying further violence in the name of survival. In examining the role of disease and malnutrition, it becomes clear that these were not mere footnotes to the history of the English colonies but central forces that shaped their development. The colonies that ultimately thrived did so not just through military strength or economic enterprise but by overcoming these biological and environmental challenges. Those that failed often did so because they could not escape the deadly grip of hunger and pestilence. The story of the English colonies, then, is as much a story of resilience in the face of invisible enemies as it is of conflict and conquest.